How does a nation, separated by an ocean from the raging heart of a global war, find itself dragged into the deadliest conflict in human history? For Mexico in the spring of 1942, the answer would come not as a diplomatic note, but as a flash of fire on the dark waters of the Gulf. While Europe and the Pacific burned, Mexico stood as an observer, still healing the wounds of its own revolution. The nation, under President Manuel Ávila Camacho, clung to a policy of cautious neutrality. The battles in far-off lands were distant echoes, stories from another reality. But destiny had other plans for a country that simply wished to be left in peace. The first tremor of this unwanted fate arrived just past midnight on May 13, 1942. The Mexican-flagged oil tanker, the Potrero del Llano, was sailing peacefully off the coast of Florida, its hull brightly illuminated and its neutral flag clearly visible, a standard protocol to prevent accidental attacks. Its mission was simple: transport vital petroleum to the United States. Suddenly, the night was shattered by a violent explosion. A torpedo fired from the German U-boat U-564 ripped through the tanker's hull. The ship was engulfed in flames before sinking into the dark waters of the Atlantic. The sailors, caught by surprise in the dead of night, had little time to react. The sea claimed the lives of 14 Mexican crewmen. Their only crime had been to transport oil. The news sent a shockwave across Mexico. This was not a distant battle. It was an attack on a sovereign, neutral nation. Yet, before the outrage could fully settle, the Germans struck again. Just 1 week later, on May 20th, another Mexican tanker, the Faja de Oro, met the same fiery end, torpedoed by U-boat U-106. 8 more sailors perished. The Mexican people demanded justice. The blood of their countrymen had been spilled, and the nation's patience had run out. Indignation swept from the streets of the capital to the coastal villages. On May 22nd, President Ávila Camacho's government delivered a firm ultimatum to the Axis powers: provide immediate explanations and compensation for the attacks, or there would be consequences. The response from Berlin was silence, and in the language of war, silence is a statement of defiance. On May 28, 1942, with the support of a unified Congress, President Manuel Ávila Camacho addressed his nation. He declared that a state of war now existed between Mexico and the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. In his historic speech, he spoke words that would resonate for decades. The state of war is war. Yes, war with all its consequences. The war that Mexico would have wanted to banish forever from the methods of civilized coexistence, but which, in cases like the present, constitutes the only means of affirming our independence and conserving the dignity of the Republic. For the second time in less than a century, Mexico is entering a global conflict. But this time, the battle would not be fought on its own soil. Mexico's participation in the Second World War would take 3 distinct and vital forms. The first, and perhaps most significant front, was economic. With its entry into the war, Mexico transformed into a crucial logistical and material arsenal for the Allied cause. The nationalization of its oil industry in 1938, a move that had initially strained relations with the United States and Great Britain, now became a strategic asset. The state-owned company Petróleos Mexicanos, or Pemex, ramped up production to unprecedented levels. Mexican petroleum, the very resource the Potrero del Llano and Faja de Oro were carrying, began to flow north in a steady, uninterrupted stream. This oil fueled the tanks rolling across North Africa, the bombers taking off from British airfields, and the naval fleets patrolling the Pacific. It was, quite literally, the lifeblood of the Allied war machine. But the contribution did not stop at oil. Mexico's vast natural wealth was mobilized. Zinc and copper, essential for shell casings and wiring, were mined in massive quantities. Mercury, vital for detonators and scientific instruments, was extracted and shipped. Ores like antimony and tungsten, critical for hardening steel and armor plating and munitions, were prioritized for the war effort. The agricultural sector also played its part, exporting henequen fiber for rope, along with timber, food, and other essential goods. This massive transfer of resources represented a fundamental pillar of Mexico's commitment, a silent but powerful contribution to the eventual Allied victory. The Second Front was a war fought not with bullets, but with sweat and toil. On August 4, 1942, Mexico and the United States signed the Mexican Farm Labor Agreement. This initiative would become known as the Bracero program. With millions of American men drafted into the armed forces, the United States faced a severe labor shortage, particularly in the agricultural sector, that fed both the nation and its armies abroad. Fields lay fallow, and crops were at risk of rotting before they could be harvested. The Bracero program was the solution. Recruitment centers were established across Mexico, drawing in hundreds of thousands of men from rural communities with the promise of stable work and fair wages. In cities like Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Irapuato, vast crowds of hopefuls would gather, sometimes for days, waiting for their chance. For many, it was an opportunity to escape rural poverty and support their families back home. They underwent medical examinations and bureaucratic processing before being placed on trains headed north. These men, known as braceros, a term derived from the Spanish word for arm, signifying a manual laborer, were the unsung foot soldiers of the home front. They were sent to farms across the American West and Southwest, from the fertile valleys of California to the sugar beet fields of Colorado and the cotton plantations of Texas. Their labor was physically grueling, involving long hours under a punishing sun, for wages that, while better than what they could earn at home, were often below those of their American counterparts. The agreement stipulated fair treatment, adequate housing, and a guaranteed wage. However, the reality on the ground was often starkly different. Braceros frequently faced discrimination and segregation in the communities where they worked. Housing was often substandard, consisting of crowded, unsanitary barracks. The promise of fair wages was sometimes undermined by unscrupulous contractors who made unjust deductions for food, lodging, and transportation. A key provision of the program was the mandatory deduction of 10% from each worker's salary. This money was to be transferred to a savings fund in Mexico, to be paid out to the workers upon their return, ensuring they had a nest egg to restart their lives. It was a well-intentioned policy meant to encourage savings and prevent workers from being left destitute. But for decades, this fund was mired in corruption and bureaucratic neglect. The vast majority of the braceros, or their families, never saw a single cent of their hard-earned savings. Theirs was a silent contribution, a story of immense sacrifice, and for many, profound injustice that would only begin to be acknowledged and rectified generations later. These men had fueled the agricultural engine of the Allied war effort, ensuring that the soldiers on the front lines and the civilians at home were fed. Their contribution, though often overlooked, was indispensable. The third front was one of direct military action, a chapter written in the skies over the Pacific. This is the story of the Mexican Expeditionary Air Force, famously known as the 201st Fighter Squadron, or the Aztec Eagles. Following Mexico's declaration of war, President Ávila Camacho made the decision that the nation's participation must include a direct combat role to solidify its place among the Allied nations. The Air Force was chosen as the most practical and impactful branch to deploy. A call for volunteers went out, and from the ranks of the Mexican military, an elite group of around 300 men was selected. They were pilots, mechanics, armorers, radiomen, and support staff, all driven by a sense of patriotic duty. This unit was sent to the United States for intensive training, a critical step to prepare them for the advanced aircraft and complex combat environment they would face. They began their training at Randolph Field in Texas, the West Point of the Air, where they learned American military doctrine and honed their English skills. From there, they moved to Foster Field for advanced flight training, and finally, to Majors Field in Greenville, Texas, where they were introduced to their warhorse, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was a beast of an aircraft, large, heavily armed, and incredibly durable. It was one of the most effective fighter bombers of the war, and the Mexican pilots had to master its every quirk. The training was rigorous and unforgiving, pushing the men to their limits and forging them into a cohesive and deadly fighting unit. In early 1945, with their training complete, the 201st Squadron was deemed ready for combat. They were assigned to the 5th Air Force under the command of the legendary General Douglas MacArthur and deployed to the Philippines. The war in the Pacific was in its final, brutal stages. The Allies were engaged in the painstaking and bloody campaign to liberate the Philippines from the occupying forces of the Japanese Empire. Operating out of Porac Airfield in Luzon, the Aztec Eagles were immediately thrown into the fray. Their P-47S, now emblazoned with the distinctive tricolor roundel of the Mexican Air Force, flew their first combat mission in June of 1945. Their primary role was not the high-altitude dogfights of the Battle of Britain, but the dangerous, low-level work of ground support. They flew missions to bomb and strafe enemy positions, provide close air support for American and Filipino ground troops, and conduct armed reconnaissance flights over enemy territory. They flew against Japanese positions in the Cagayan Valley, attacked enemy airfields in Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, and played a critical role in clearing the final pockets of Japanese resistance during the Battle of Marikina. Over the course of their deployment, the squadron flew 96 combat missions, accumulating nearly 2,000 hours of flight time. They distinguished themselves with their courage and skill, earning the respect of their American allies. The cost was not without sacrifice. Several pilots were lost in action, their names forever etched into the honor roll of Mexico's war heroes. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Aztec Eagles had proven their nation's commitment on the battlefield. But beyond these recognized fronts of economic support, labor, and direct combat lay a fourth, far darker chapter of Mexico's war. A story that remained buried in the archives for decades, shrouded in the chaos of a continent torn asunder. It is the forgotten tale of the Mexicans who, through twists of fate, found themselves trapped in the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe and became victims of the Third Reich's machinery of terror. One of these men was Joseph Salazar. A mechanic and former officer in the Mexican army, Salazar had traveled to Europe before the war. In 1943, he was living in Perpignan, a city in Vichy, France, near the Spanish border, a known hub for refugees and resistance activity. It was here that his life took an unimaginable turn. He was arrested by agents of the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. The exact reasons for his detention remain a mystery, lost to the fog of war. After his liberation, Salazar himself stated that he was accused of sabotage against the German army and acts of espionage, though no formal charges were ever proven. He may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps he was indeed involved in the French resistance, like so many other foreign nationals trapped in occupied territory. Whatever the reason, his fate was sealed. Salazar was transported first to the Compiègne Royalieu internment camp, a notorious transit point for political prisoners. Then, on January 17, 1944, he was herded with over 1,900 other prisoners into the suffocating confines of a freight car. For 2 days and 2 nights, the train rumbled across Europe. Without adequate food, water, or air, the journey itself was an ordeal of unimaginable suffering, one that many did not survive. Salazar's destination was even worse than he could have feared. Buchenwald, one of the largest and most brutal of the Nazi concentration camps, located near the city of Weimar in Germany. Upon his arrival, Joseph Salazar, the Mexican citizen, ceased to exist. He was stripped of his name, his possessions, and his dignity. He was given a number, 10756. He was forced to wear the infamous striped uniform of a prisoner, a symbol of his complete subjugation. But his uniform bore a peculiar detail that set him apart from the thousands of others. Sewn onto his garment was an inverted red triangle, the mark of a political prisoner. However, inside this triangle, the SS guards had stitched a single letter, M for Mexicaner. This small letter made him an anomaly in a system obsessed with rigid, dehumanizing categories. The Nazis had specific markings for each group they persecuted: a pink triangle for homosexuals, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, black for so-called asocials, and the yellow Star of David for Jews. But a Mexican political prisoner did not fit neatly into their twisted worldview. This strange bureaucratic ambiguity likely saved his life. While Soviet prisoners of war were treated with extreme brutality, and Jewish prisoners were condemned to systematic extermination in the camps of the East, the few Mexican prisoners occupied a strange, undefined limbo. Salazar became an object of curiosity. The guards, steeped in their own perverse logic, did not know exactly what to do with him. This confusion, born from a mix of geopolitical factors and pure administrative anomaly, afforded him a fragile, paper-thin shield against the worst of the camp's horrors. He was not entirely alone. Over the years, historical research has painstakingly uncovered the names of at least 10 Mexicans, 6 men and 4 women, who were imprisoned in the Nazi camp system. The 4 women, Sisters Susan and Denise Klotz, Alicia Dreyfus, and Anita Germain, were captured not for their Mexican nationality, but for their Jewish heritage. Their stories are interwoven with the horrors of the Holocaust. All 4 were transported to the infamous Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp in occupied Poland. Their final fate, like that of millions, remains unknown. They perished in the gas chambers or from the brutal conditions, their Mexican citizenship offering no protection from the Nazis' genocidal fury. For Joseph Salazar, survival in Buchenwald was a daily battle against starvation, disease, and the casual cruelty of the SS. He was put to work in the camp's factories, a slave laborer for the German war effort. He witnessed unspeakable horrors, but managed to endure. On April 11, 1945, his ordeal finally came to an end. Units of the U.S. Third Army, advancing through Germany, reached the gates of Buchenwald and liberated the camp. The American soldiers were met with an indescribable panorama of death and suffering. More than 21,000 emaciated, sick, and traumatized prisoners were found alive, ghosts haunting the landscape of their own torment. Among them were Joseph Salazar and another Mexican, Juan del Piero. They were free. When the war finally ended, the contrast in the fates of these different groups of Mexicans could not have been more dramatic. The heroes of the 201st Squadron, the Aztec Eagles, returned to Mexico in November of 1945 to a triumphant national welcome. A massive parade was held in their honor in Mexico City. On November 18th, President Ávila Camacho received them with full military honors in the capital's Grand Zocalo, presenting the squadron's banner back to them in a symbolic gesture of gratitude. Their courage was celebrated, their story immortalized in monuments, history books, in the nation's collective memory. They were and remain a source of immense national pride. In stark contrast, the few Mexican survivors of the Nazi concentration camps, like Joseph Salazar, returned in silence. There were no parades, no medals, no official recognition. Their stories, too horrific for a nation celebrating victory to comprehend, remained buried, lost in the cracks of official history. For decades, their ordeal went unacknowledged, their sacrifice forgotten. The same was true for the Braceros. They returned home, not to accolades, but to a bureaucratic battle for their stolen wages that would last for the rest of their lives. A fight that, for many, continues to this day. The history of Mexico's multifaceted role in World War II teaches us a powerful and paradoxical lesson about the nature of war and memory. It reveals that a nation's contribution cannot be measured by a single metric. It was fought by pilots in the sky, by laborers in the fields, and by silent survivors in the darkest corners of human cruelty. The letter M on Joseph Salazar's uniform, a simple administrative mark, became a symbol of a bizarre, life-saving privilege in a universe of death. It was a status that, for reasons almost incomprehensible, granted him a fragile shield against the horrors that consumed millions around him. Today, as the last direct witnesses of that era leave us, our responsibility to preserve and transmit these varied and complex stories becomes even more urgent. The monument to the Aztec Eagles stands proudly in Chapultepec Park, a testament to their valor. But the stories of the Braceros and the prisoners remind us that heroism takes many forms, and that sacrifice is not always met with honor. This is a reminder that Mexico too was there, in the trenches, in the concentration camps, in the skies of the Philippines, and in the fields of California. Each of these stories deserves to be told, remembered, and honored, not as a mere statistic, but as the profound tale of human beings who faced extraordinary circumstances with a quiet dignity and an unbreakable will to endure. What part of Mexico's involvement in World War II surprised you the most? The Aztec Eagle pilots, the Bracero workers, or the forgotten prisoners in Nazi camps? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are many more World War II stories waiting to be told, one powerful narrative at a time.